Okay, so by the summer of 1861, just a couple of months after Fort Sumter, uh, the Anaconda, so-called Anaconda Plan, is thrown in the trash, and Lincoln comes under all this pressure to capture Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. Now, it's unclear to me even if the Union had captured Richmond if that would have ended the war, but this was the thinking anyway, especially among newspapers. And you had this big campaign among northern newspapers, forward to Richmond, forward to Richmond. There's this hysteria. Let's capture Richmond. Let's end the war now. The problem was, and I've got a map up here. It's slightly confusing because it's got 2 years worth of battles, but for now, you'll see Bull Run, Manassas. And this is where, in the summer of '61, Confederate troops have deployed, just a little bit west of Washington, D.C. They're not stupid. The Confederacy knows that Lincoln is going to try to capture Richmond. And so instead of falling back to Richmond, they go close to D.C. It's tough for Lincoln because, of course, Virginia, D.C. borders on Virginia. So Confederate troops are just about 30 miles from the nation's capital. And if you go there now, it's very, very suburban. And they're kind of blocking any attempt by the Union Army, these Confederate troops, blocking the attempt of the Union Army to capture Richmond. And if you go down the map, you'll see Richmond, which is down here. Today it's a couple-hour drive from Washington, D.C. The commander, and Catton talks about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, was a guy named McDowell. And Irvin McDowell, and believe me, he's going to disappear from the story pretty quickly. He has about 35,000 troops. Lincoln's saying to him, you need to go capture Richmond. The public's on my ass about this. Let's end this thing. And McDowell says, look, the troops are green. They're not trained. I mean, this war just started 2 months ago. The U.S. Army, when the Civil War started, was only like 13,000 men, and it takes a while to raise an army and to train an army. In fact, it's going to take a couple of years. And McDowell, who's not a great general, but he did recognize this, and he says to Lincoln, look, I can't attack Richmond right now. I can't go through these Confederate troops because the army just isn't trained enough. They're very green. And Lincoln said, well, your army's green, but the Confederate army is green as well. They're not well trained either. Everybody's green, so go ahead and make this attempt. Go ahead and capture Richmond. And so McDowell his hand is forced. Everybody knew that the battle, this first battle of the Civil War, would be in a place called Manassas Junction or Bull Run. When we talk about it, we're talking about the exact same thing. It's about 30 miles, maybe a little bit less, away from Washington, D.C. It was where Confederate troops were deployed. And in mid-July 1861, just a couple of months after Fort Sumter, McDowell starts marching his army from D.C., about 35,000 men. The Union Army would grow exponentially, but at this early point in the war, it's only about 35,000 men. And he starts marching towards Manassas. And there's a lot of excitement in D.C. There's very famous stories of people bringing picnic lunches to watch the battle. They think the Union Army is just going to roll over the Confederates, and it's going to be very, very easy, and it's going to be a very, very quick Union victory. And nobody expected what they saw. When the Union Army attacked on July 21st, there was very, very tough fighting, and ultimately, although the Union Army had some initial successes, it was defeated by the Confederate Army. So what we call the first Battle of Bull Run, or the first Battle of Manassas, Again, there were two battles of Bull Run. One was in 61 and one was in 1862. But the first battle of Bull Run was a major defeat for the Union Army. McDowell later wrote, the retreat soon became a rout, and this soon degenerated into a panic. Another Union officer said no efforts could induce a single regiment to form after the retreat was commenced. So what you had was the Union Army starts retreating, the defeated Union Army starts retreating towards D.C., and they have to deal with all these picnickers who had come from D.C. to watch the battle. And so it's just a completely chaotic scene. The Union Army is defeated by the Confederate Army at Manassas. They retreat, in a rout. They're trying to get back to their fortifications in D.C. as quickly as they can. They have to deal with other people on the road who have come out to see a picnic, and it's just a total chaos. It's very humiliating defeat. Lincoln in D.C. receives a note. The day is lost. Save Washington and the remnants of the army. And on July 22nd, the Union Army got back to D.C., got back to the fortifications. Okay, so the first Battle of Bull Run, a major Union defeat. Again, the point was the Union Army wanted to go through the Confederate Army so they could go further south and capture Richmond. Doesn't happen. Okay, a couple points about the first Battle of Bull Run. It shows what we're going to see in the East during the Civil War. The Union Army is constantly losing battles. The Union Army is going to be losing battles for the first 3 years of the war. But the Confederate Army does not have the power to completely defeat the Union. I guess what I'm saying is the Confederates can win these battles. They win these battles tactically. But the Confederacy doesn't have the power to follow up on these victories by defeating the Union effort as a whole. So what we're going to see for the next 3 years in Virginia is we're going to see a number of defeats of the Union Army, but the Confederacy does not have the power to use these defeats to bring the Union to its knees and force it to compromise and force it to let it go on its merry way and become an independent nation. So although the Confederate Army is constantly defeating the Union Army is kind of like, it's like the Walking Dead or something. It's always springing back to life. One of the things is the Union has, 23 million population, so many more, so much more than the South, that it had deep, deep reserves of manpower. So even when its armies are being defeated, it's always able, the Union Army is always able to, in Virginia, is always able to reorganize and come back for another battle. And so on a tactical level, the Confederacy is often beating the Union Army in specific battles, but they're not defeating the Union as a whole, because the Union is too strong and the Confederacy is actually too weak to make use, take advantage of these tactical victories it has in the field. The other thing I think, which is fair to say too, is that Union soldiers were very, very plucky. They knew that they were getting defeated. They blamed their generals for their defeats. They thought their generals really sucked, and actually in Virginia they were right. And I think the most important thing is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln just was not going to give up the fight. He knew he had manpower resources. He knew he had more industry than the South. So what you're seeing is the Union Army is constantly coming back, being defeated, getting reorganized, going into the field over and over and over again. So again, the Confederates are able to defeat the Union Army in specific battles, but they're unable to take advantage of these battles to force the Union, to force Abraham Lincoln to give to give the Confederacy their independence. Lincoln has a number of cards he can play. He has a number of resources in terms of manpower and industrial power. But I think Lincoln's biggest resource is his absolute devotion and dedication and determination to do whatever it took to keep the Union together, to bring the rebellious states of the slave South back into the Union. And he was going to play every card he could. And so really, ultimately, it's Lincoln's determination which is keeping, I think, the Confederacy from winning the Civil War.